afternoon and welcome everyone to the first webinar in our Spotlight series on quality of care, today on health technology assessment. Thank you for joining us and happy International Women's Day. As I mentioned, this is the first webinar in our Spotlight series on healthcare quality, and we will be focusing on health technology assessment, how health technology assessment links to quality of care, what we have been doing in this area, and perhaps also what we could be doing more or differently. Before introducing our excellent speakers, let me take a moment to introduce some important housekeeping rules on the one hand, and also on the other hand, the rationale of our Spotlight series on quality and the topics we have chosen for the webinars. The observatory webinars follow a specific structure that we use every week. Those of you who have been here before are used to it. We have a keynote presentation today on the link between health technology assessment and quality, followed by two spotlight speakers bringing in their perspective. We advertised and we're hoping for 4 speakers, but we had a 50% attrition rate due to current events. And then followed by a discussion also with inputs from your side. So we are hoping really on your participation. And there are 2 ways of doing that. One is that you can always use the chat box, and I see some of you are doing that already, to give us your input, your questions, or your comments to what you are hearing in the webinar. And we will also ask you at specific points during the webinar to answer some poll questions so we have a better understanding and you have a better understanding of who is all in the webinar with us today. I will now take a couple of minutes to introduce the overall rationale of our quality Spotlight series very briefly, because you're here on HTA today, so we don't want to take away from that, but just to give an understanding of how we conceived of the series that you have joined today. So as the observatory webinars have showcased before, we are dealing with policy topics or health that are high on the health policy agenda. We had a long period of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're focusing on a number of other issues that are of course also linked to our health systems building back after the pandemic. So in this respect, we thought that focusing on quality of care, this is a very opportune timing for that. And we have 3 webinars planned today on health technology assessment that I hope you will enjoy. Next week on clinical practice guidelines, and the week after on the 22nd on paying for quality, or P4Q. The webinar series is inspired by our big study on quality of care, improving healthcare quality in Europe. We worked on that together with the OECD and published it in 2019. And my colleagues will be posting the link to the study in the chat box for those of you who are not aware of it. There we had a twofold goal of looking at conceptually how we can understand quality strategies, and then a range of quality strategies and what we know about them and what we can do to implement them better. Just a very brief here, don't read the entire table, you don't need it. There is a lot of discussion around the definition of quality of care, and of course, depending on how we understand that, we measure it differently, we act differently to improve it. So for our study and also for our webinars, we focus on this idea of quality of health care being the extent to which healthcare, and with that we understand also health services, is effective, safe, and responds to the needs and preferences of patients. This has been established as the core trifecta, so effective, safe, and people-centered. And this usually gets supplemented by other elements, but just for you, for your understanding of where we started with the study and where we are also going with our webinars. This is the way that we define quality for that purpose here. But again, many of you are here and all of you will have perhaps slightly different opinions on that and how you see that. But this is the way we approach this. And I will mention very briefly in the book, we highlight, except or next to the conceptual considerations of what quality is, how can we understand quality strategies and how can we measure quality. We focused on a number of strategies that we see here as chapters. And I think Reinhard Busse, who will do the keynote on HTA in a minute, will come back to that. The main takeaway message from this image is essentially that there are a range of mechanisms or movements that claim that they contribute to improving quality of care. All of them are necessary, all of them are complementary, but if we need an overall strategy on quality of care, we need to understand how they fit together. So this is where this webinar this webinar series starts, with the triad of the Nabedian of structure, process, and outcome as a core for understanding quality of care. And we have in our first webinar today, health technology assessment, more on structures and inputs of care. Next week, clinical guidelines, more on the processes of care. And then the last webinar on the 22nd, this idea of looking at outcomes, pay for quality, financial incentives. And that's all I'm going to say for this. If you're interested in understanding the rationale, please do look at the study. It's freely available online. And I think we are now at the point, a very important point, of moving specifically into health technology assessment. So the topic of today, we're focusing on HTA. HTA, as you know, is a form of policy informing research or decision-making informing research. I'm not going to talk about this more because Reinhard Busse is going to do that in a minute. We have, as I mentioned, 3 excellent speakers with us today. We have Reinhard Busse, professor at the Department of Healthcare Management at the Berlin University of Technology, also a co-director of the observatory. He's also the editor-in-chief of Health Policy, the journal, and has been a pioneer in HTA, European collaboration in HTA, and an HTA expert for more than 20 years. So Reinhard will give us a keynote on HTA and the link between health technology assessment and quality of care. Then we have Dr. Matthias Pellet from the Federal Joint Committee in Germany. Matthias is the head of the Medical Consultancy Department, and the Federal Joint Committee, for those of you who are not familiar, is the highest instance of the self-governance in the German healthcare system. Bringing together physicians, dentists, hospitals, and health insurance funds. And perhaps most important, the detail on the Federal Joint Committee today is that it's responsible both for determining the benefit basket, so in that sense, coverage decisions, and so the link to HTA there is clear, but also for setting the quality assurance framework in the German healthcare system. And I think Matthias will reflect on that. And then we have with us Elena Petelos, who is the Vice President for Health Technology Assessment at the European Public Health Association, and is also the co-chair of the Real World Evidence and Artificial Intelligence group at the Health Technology Assessment International. Elena also brings a double expertise in terms of understanding different contexts, as she works both at a university in Crete, in Greece, but also at the university in Maastricht in the Netherlands. So as you can see, a group of very strong experts to discuss with us exactly where we are with HTA and how we can make sure that we use it to the best possible extent to improve quality of care. And I think we are now, without further ado, at the point to get started with our technical content. Before that, let me go to my colleague, Erica Richardson.
Welcome, everybody. Great to see such high numbers in the audience for this topic. But before we launch into the presentations, we'd just like to ask you a few questions so that we can get a feel for the audience. And you can share with us some of the information you have on your backgrounds. So, Annalisa, if you could launch the poll. Okay, so just 2 quick questions. First of all, in your country, is health technology assessment used to improve the quality of care? Is that something that it's specifically used for? That's a straightforward yes/no question. And then secondly, multiple choice question. What does HTA for decision making cover in your country? So does it cover safety and effectiveness, cost effectiveness, budget impact, ethical issues, legal consequences, all of the above, or indeed none of the above, particularly if HTA is not formally established in your country? So yes, if you could share a little bit of information with us, that would be really, really helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And now over to you, Reinhard, for the keynote and the introduction to the topic. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, and welcome everybody to this important session. And obviously, we have very little time, and these are 2 topics, both very dear to my heart: health technology assessment and quality of care. And Dimi has already highlighted that we had worked over several years on this book on improving healthcare quality in Europe. And the idea was a bit similar to this webinar series, that in the observatory, we got the feedback from policymakers, and we were aware of this, that so many different camps, let's say the HTA people, the evidence-based medicine people, the guidelines people, the pay-per-performance people, they all come to the policymakers and say, I am doing a great job here for the quality of care. And policymakers sometimes get confused about all these things. And so we decided to disentangle things a bit and said, okay, what does it really mean, quality of care? And Dimi has already highlighted that the book starts with the historic development of what we understand by quality of care. And the most important things here, and this is the way the international organizations such as WHO currently use it, that we mean that quality health services would be effective, safe, and people-centered. And clearly there is a range around them, timely, equitable, integrated, efficient. And I come back to some of these, because this is already highlighting one of the problems policymakers have, that some people use the term quality very widely. And we said, no, we need to confine it to providing quality services. And quality is a dimension which we use to describe the degree of health services, whether they are effective, safe, and people-centered for people who receive health services. Obviously, with the whole debate of universal health coverage, we all understand that quality is not the only important consideration when we rate the performance of health systems. So we need accessibility, including financial protection coverage, but also geographical accessibility. And then for those people who can access services, then it makes a difference how the quality is. And then we look at population health outcomes and responsiveness as a result of this multiplicative effect. And then we can divide this by the inputs, usually money, but also human resources, hospital beds, and so on. And then we get something which we could call system-wide cost effectiveness. So how much outcomes, how much responsiveness do we get per money per unit of money? And this is what we call health system performance. So we have the broader performance, including all these dimensions, and we have the more narrow quality. And then and there is a range of what we in the book, it's called Improving Healthcare Quality in Europe, Characteristics, Effectiveness, and Implementation of Different Strategies. So we call the health technology assessment in our book is a strategy. And you see the chapters here already highlighted by Dimi here. And clearly we had huge debate, how can we sort all the different strategies? And there is a structure, process, outcome thing. There are other ones like a continuous improvement cycle. And so we said, okay, we have certain strategies which set mainly standards for structures and inputs. Then we have some with steering and monitoring quality of processes, and what we call the third block, leveraging processes and outcomes of care to ensure improvement. And we have, as Dimi highlighted, selected one of these for each of the coming 3 weeks. Today, we start with this yellow marked block here. And besides health technologies, because when we look at quality services, we have the technology, be it a drug or a medical device, but we also have the people who provide it, the health professionals. We have an institution in which it is provided. In the institution, we can say it's both the building, the physical structures, but also the work of the professionals inside it. And so we have these 4 strategies. In all of these chapters, we looked at the question of what are the characteristics of the strategies, what is being done in European countries, what do we know about the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of the structure, how can the strategy be implemented, and conclusions for policymakers. In the first block, the block on the setting standards, where HTA is sorted, and we only basically look here at the HTA line. So this is in very short. I mean, it's a whole chapter, and I'm only highlighting some issues here. So the characteristics of the HTA strategy to improve quality of care is that it provides the evidence base for decision making on cost, effective and safe technologies. I come back to that in a minute. And we looked at how far are we in Europe, and I'm interested whether our little poll here reflects this. So we have a national legal framework for health technology assessment in almost all EU member states, mostly using HTA for pharmaceuticals, but in 20 countries also for medical devices. 18 countries at the time of writing of the book had HTA agencies with more than 10 full-time staff, and only 4 countries had bigger HTA agencies with more than 100 full-time staff. We should also say that while HTA is a strategy to improve the quality of care, that there are no formal studies assessing the effectiveness of HTA as a strategy, whether it's really doing this job. But let me say what is the reasoning behind using HTA as one of the strategies, clearly in line with the other ones, to improve the quality of care. And that the first thing is we have to see it vis-a-vis some other strategies. When we look at the technology, and again, it could be a pharmaceutical or a medical device, there's a range of questions which we should ask as a society. Is it safe in the short term? Does it function in healthy people? Does it function in ill-health persons? Does it work compared to doing nothing? Does it work better compared with an alternative in study conditions? Does it work better compared with an alternative under real life conditions? Is it cost effective versus an alternative? Is it as cost effective everywhere? Meaning no matter in which hospital or in which physician's office we use it. By whom should it be used to be effective? Is it the same whether it's done by a GP or by a specialist? And is it safe in the long run? And clearly this is when we could expand these lists of questions regarding a technology, and then we have different instruments to do it. We have different methodologies. We at first have uncontrolled one-armed studies, and we have the typical controlled studies. We have registries, and we have the degree of, or the stage of pharmaceutical licensing, the medical device certification. And we see a gap here further down, and this is where HTA comes in. The core of health technology assessment lies in the question whether it works better compared with an alternative under real life conditions, and whether it's cost effective versus the alternative. Often the data for that are lacking, and we look at study condition or on studies under study conditions because we lack the real life data. But we also want, I mean, the idea is that we have all these data. And HTA, we sometimes say, is a bridge, the bridge between scientific rigorousness and political decision making. And I want to do it, I want to extend this bridge to do a triple jump here, which I call the quality proposition of HTA. So by doing HTA in a given country, the first element is that we review the technology's effectiveness and safety in controlled trials. The second stage then is that this review of the technology's effectiveness and safety forms the base for an evidence-informed decision on coverage and or reimbursement. So should we use this technology in the health system? Should we pay for it? And remember, there is a close link between accessibility and quality, because accessibility means that people are covered and that technologies are covered, and then there's not too high cost sharing. So this is the second bit, but still, this is not directly influence the quality of care. Based on this decision on coverage and reimbursement, we are hoping, and this is a big question, how much do we see this? But this is a quality proposition that we influence the actual appropriate usage of the technology. So one of the two important components of quality, do the right thing. That physicians, other health professionals, patients choose the right technology. The second element of quality would be do the thing right, which is not meant here primarily. Then we go into complications by surgeons and so on. Let me introduce another idea here, that the review of the technology's effectiveness and safety in controlled trials is basically something which we can do globally. I mean, if I do a systematic review, it's the same as if somebody in Ukraine is doing the systematic review, while the decision making is usually national, and the actual influence of the quality is often regional or local. And this has brought forward the idea that if certain elements are global or at least European, then why do we not create them together? And this has led to the idea of this UNETA network, which has now been operating until now for more than 10 years, and which has produced a core model. Because we say, okay, the evidence on technologies, on certain ideas, especially the clinical effectiveness and the safety, is global. And we can do it together. And then we have other elements of health technology assessment, for example, on costs, on ethical considerations, which are more national. And the last development, which some of you or many of you might have heard, is the passage, the coming into force of a new EU regulation, just been published in the European legal documents on 15th of December, which for the future says we will do clinical assessment, we will do joint clinical assessments, both for pharmaceuticals and for high-risk medical devices, summarizing the evidence on the effectiveness and the safety. We will also see joint scientific consultation to technology developers, which will try to help to improve the evidence base away from only technology versus placebo to technology to actual alternative trials, and it will prepare annual reports on emerging health technologies. So I think this webinar today is very timely because we are at an important crossroad for the future development of health technology in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reinhard, for this very clear presentation on quality, the understanding of it, the link to HTA, and the understanding of HTA and where we are today, in particular in Europe. We already have quite a bit of input in the chat, which is always something that we're very happy about, but we're not going to go into that right now. We'll pick up most of the points after the spotlight presentations. So I think we move from the overall bird's eye view to a spotlight from a specific country. from Germany specifically. So we moved to Matthias Perlet. And I have to thank Matthias and Reinhard, actually, it applies to you as well, for joining us today. International Women's Day is a public holiday in Berlin, which is excellent. But we are still happy, very happy that you still joined us today for the webinar, even though you have the day off, at least in theory. So Matthias, thank you very much. Over to you for your experience.
Well, when it comes to implementation of HTA in German healthcare and the possible contribution of HTA to quality of care in Germany, we usually have to look at pharmaceuticals as an example where HTA has gone pretty far in this way. So since about 10 years, there's a legal act active in Germany, the so-called AMNOG law, which mandates that all newly licensed drugs which enter the German market are subject to the assessment of the so-called additional benefit. Remember Reinhard's slide just from a few minutes ago. And which means that every new drug has to compare its benefit against the current standard care. And after the assessment has been done and GBA has taken a decision on the so-called additional benefit, subsequently price negotiations between the sickness funds and the pharmaceutical company take place. So this is an example of some sort of a systematic approach to health technologies. So usually only very few drugs which enter the market are exempted from this law, mainly drugs that only are meant for a very few patients, so that they are not contribute anything to healthcare expenses. But it's not a coverage decision. It's just a decision on the additional benefit, which is often misunderstood. So usually there are no drugs taken off the market in Germany, at least not by GBA. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies withdraw drugs from the German market because they are frustrated with price negotiations, but that's another decision. Price negotiations are not transparent and not public. So what we know for sure is that there is no formal health economics approach behind these negotiations. And the influence on actual prescriptions and practical use is probably influenced by marketing activities from pharmaceutical companies, by clinical guidelines, and also by patient demand, but maybe also to a certain extent by the additional benefit assessment by GBA, but it is difficult to tell which influence is here the most relevant. Next, please. When it comes to non-pharmaceuticals, so we call this device-related diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. The German term for that is methods. We see a completely different situation. So it's a completely non-systematic approach. Assessments strongly depend on stakeholder applications to the GBA, and usually they are triggered by some sort of financial issues or interests. And but here coverage decisions are taken, but after about 20 years of the existence of the GBA, the German Ministry of Health and the GBA itself are still unable or unwilling to apply some sort of systematic approach to non-pharmaceutical technologies which enter the German market, including taking disinvestment decisions on obsolete technologies. Healthcare provision in hospitals and in ambulatory care is also set in different payment systems, regulatory systems, which means that contradictory decisions are possible, and financial incentives are strong here, which maybe lead also to certain overdiagnosis and over-treatments. There is some change of the situation recently, which means that's about 10 years ago. GBA has been given the mandate to commission clinical trials if evidence gaps exist on new non-pharma technologies. And so a coverage with evidence development program has been started. However, this is a very slow process, and results are not yet available, although a number of clinical trials have been started recently. Next, please. So to sum up, HTA contributes to some extent to quality of care in Germany. HTA is part of the German legal system, including also backed up by a number of court decisions, also from the highest social court in Germany. We have strong and independent HTA institutions, GBA and IQWiC. I think Germany is one of the 4 countries Reinhard just mentioned, which have more than 100 staff. But it extends only partly into healthcare due to lack of systematic implementation, especially when it comes to non-pharmaceutical technologies. However, most of the HTA reports, which are actually commissioned to the IQWiC and to other institutions, are actually used for informing decision-making, and decisions are usually reached by consensus of stakeholders within the GBA, including patient representatives. Pharmaceuticals with a large additional benefit compared to standard treatment are entitled to higher prices and are thus more likely to be prescribed in healthcare, and probably the system contributes at least to a certain extent to quality of drug therapy in Germany. And the recently started coverage with evidence development program may be able to close only few knowledge gaps regarding the efficacy of innovative device-related procedures. And this is certainly one of the weakest points where HTA not yet contributes a lot to the quality of these technologies. And HTA is particularly weak when it comes to disinvestment, when it comes to systematically assess innovative non-pharmaceutical technologies, and for some reason, economic analysis, which probably would contribute or could contribute to the efficiency in healthcare, do not play any role in Germany up to today. And so here, HTA is until now not able to contribute anything to quality in healthcare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this really important perspective from Germany, and for highlighting so well the different ways that HTA can be embedded in decision-making. I think for many people, when we think about it, we think about deciding whether something is covered or not, a yes or no decision perhaps. And we see here how that is different in a well-established system like Germany, for instance, for different technologies. But also the link to other strategies. For instance, next week's topic, clinical guidelines. I really enjoyed this difference that you highlighted on your slide about HTA giving us the basis for taking a decision about what to cover or how to price it, but then the actual, for example, prescription of medicines, depending on other elements that we would also need to steer somehow if we want to improve quality. And this is a little bit the synergy of strategies that we were talking about earlier. I think this is a very good point in our webinar to look at the poll results as we asked our participants how HTA is embedded in their countries, basically, and to see how it relates to Matthias' experience, as he highlighted just now, before going to Elena for the next snapshot. So, Erica, over to you.
Thank you very much. Annalisa, if you could put the results up on the screen. Okay, so the encouraging thing is that HTA is used to improve quality of care in about 3/4 of the people in the audience, and that in terms of what the HTA actually covers, all of the above for about 1/4 of the people in the audience, which is really interesting. But safety and effectiveness is the predominant thing, closely followed by cost effectiveness and budget impact. The ethical issues and legal consequences are less frequently included. So thank you very much for that, everybody. Thank you for your feedback. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I think this is also interestingly representative of the discussions that we've been having on HTA for a really long time, and more or less, usually when we think about current practice, this is how it goes. But reflected back to what Reinhard was talking about, the UNETA core model clearly showcases why also these other dimensions are important. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. The very active exchange in the chat continues, also with our speakers being part of it. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, Elena, we come to you for a bit of the international experience, let's say, and the collaborative experience. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitra, and thanks for the kind invite and for the well-conceived series. It's a well-conceived series, I think, that you've created. And happy International Women's Day. Now, I think the focus for me will be European versus international. We have good things in Europe. One of them is we have probably some of the best developed systems for HTA. Could you possibly confirm that you can see my screen? Because I think you see only part of it.
I could see it perfectly just now when you had present. This is great. So you
okay.
just click on.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for confirming. So I will try and give a little bit about relevance and implication for European public health, and also share some perspectives on the things that we've been discussing over the past, I would say, decade, because the story of HTA in Europe is even longer. Declaration of interest is there because topics are sensitive. So quality of care, same as concepts like value or innovation, are very multifaceted and very open to interpretation. This is a definition which is pretty broad, it's WHO based, but the elements of safety and effectiveness and people-centeredness have been touched upon already by previous speakers. When we discuss service delivery, of course, there are elements that are added to that, which have to do with timely delivery and with equitable access. And of course, how we integrate these quality products to deliver quality services. The last, perhaps also very important aspect, which relates to HTA, is avoiding waste. So touches upon resource allocation, because of course, we have finite resources. Now, the discussion of what is the role of the EU, or what is the relevance of European public health and vice versa to member state priorities and so on, is more or less captured in documents that have been generated by the Commission, white papers, UNETA was also mentioned, some very good documents to refer to in terms of what the Commission was looking for in terms of what could be achieved in Europe, have to do with the opinions of the expert panel for investment in healthcare. And there it was highlighted pretty early on, this is a 2014 opinion, that innovative technologies have an opportunity cost. And this is also the case with medicines. Cancer pricing was a very big issue and still is. And of course, this cross-border dimension also was of relevance to ensuring quality on what was procured being cost effective in member states, but potentially also across the EU. There was a dimension of the cross-border care directive, and of course the need to invest or disinvest in different products, but also how to boost innovation in terms of R&D, in terms of agreements, because after all, the EU is a union in terms of market. And of course, there was a discussion on how we would ensure that people moving across borders, patients, would receive the high quality care. And critically, the limitation limitations that are captured in 168, we're arguing that there was not so much that we could do, perhaps because public health is the remit of member states, and the union can only act to complement national policies. There is a lot of leeway in that, and as we have seen, a lot of things could be done despite this article, but it has taken a lot of time to get there, and we're still very active in elaborating on this. Now, the basis for HTA regulation, and this is quite important to remember, was to get a deeper and fairer internal market with a strengthened industrial base. So this is the basis upon which regulation was built, and regulation was painstaking effort, I think, on the part of the Commission, many experts, stakeholders, and of course, joint action outputs. And in essence, it establishes a supporting framework and procedures for cooperation, and introduces a mechanism where the evidence and the information, and of course, the JCA, because we're discussing solely clinical assessment, is submitted by the health technology developer only once at the EU level. So we have a facilitation of this type of submission. Beautifully, if you like, or very open to future collaboration, it lays down common rules and methodologies for JCA, because we have a lot of disparities there, and opens perhaps discussion and debate for further collaboration methodologies. Now, there are some explicit links to the quality of care there. We do have, we don't treat, if you like, medicines and medical devices the same way, but in terms of clinical aspect assessment, the aspects that are captured in the regulation and in the process thereof are the description of the health problem and how this is addressed in terms of the health technology in its current use, which, by the way, standard of care be highly divergent from country to country. So the comparative element is challenging. The description of the technical characteristics of the health technology, which is particularly challenging for medical devices that were mentioned by Matthias, because you do a trial with a medical device and there are multiple iterations as it evolves. So what you are actually testing in a trial is not what you're going to actually deliver to people. So safety and quality there have a quite different hue. And of course, there's the aspect of the relative clinical effectiveness and the relative safety of the technology. And there, the aspects of assessing economic, social, ethical, organizational aspects are very critical, because ultimately payers need to make decisions. HTA is a decision-making tool, and it's there, of course, to generate things like clinical guidelines, but also to allow decision-making in terms of what we buy, what we stop buying, investment is investment, at what price we buy it, and to whom we actually give it, very simply or simplistically. Now, there has been a lot of discussion in the past few years for RWE, and because, of course, this is a segment I'm pretty active in, there is tremendous potential for exponential technologies in terms of data collection, in terms of, activities, in terms of putting all of this together and having unified information systems and making evidence-based more robust, but also in terms of moving away from more traditional and rigid, if you like, submissions that are focused solely on RCT and terminate at the point, if you like, of market entry, and have a more life cycle approach to collecting data, ensuring safety, and so on. For public health interventions, COVID made that starkly clear that we need to have this. Vaccines are regulated as medicinal product in the EU regulation. And of course, this is also important to remember. We have a very important critical focus for rare diseases, for cancers, for patient access to innovation, but also we need to have optimal resource allocation for all EU citizens across the different modalities that are comprising the health system and ensuring its resilience and quality of care, but quality of care also encompassing promotion, prevention, treatment. Critically for public health interventions, for example, vaccination is examined in the context of protecting for a specific disease, but there are also other modalities of not getting ill. For example, we have had a lot of discussion on the AMR, and how this correlates to assessments. We also have a very divergent, in the EU, we have the highest income countries, but we have very different abilities and capacities in different bodies and mechanisms across the EU that can contribute or supplement the JCA. We don't have also the most robust infrastructure for generating high quality data across the board, and we're still lagging behind in terms of standardizing and innovating for methodologies. critically at the moment, there's a lot of discussion on what can be done for increasing preparedness and harmonizing reporting. But also in terms of, I think you also have a dedicated slot in that in terms of implications for R&D and innovation. There are some very interesting legislative instruments and regulation that are driving how we utilize the potential of these new technologies. Of course, the GDPR, data protection, can be both a barrier but an opportunity to discuss how we collect, process, including secondary use of data. There is, of course, a cross-border EU framework. There's a proposal for regulation laying down harmonized rules on artificial intelligence, which I think we'll see more and more in future discussion, because of where you have an AI, iterations change very rapidly, both in methodologies and where you have it embedded in a product. There's the DCA and the DMA, which are also very important because we have more or less everything becoming a kind of device, being linked to an app or some sort of digital measurement, and then Convention for Cybercrime of the Council of Europe, where, of course, we look into what other types of medicines or devices are entering the EU. Now, in terms of gaps and barriers, this is important to remember that, as I said, we have to make decisions. So the economic evaluation and the negotiation aspect, there are other initiatives. We have seen the Valletta, we have seen Beneluxa. And there are, at the moment, many other partnerships that are linking to pricing and negotiation, which HTA is distinctly from. But there needs to be some discussion on how this can be linked in terms of joint procurement. And also, exactly because of COVID, although this was discussed before, there is the aspect of how we go to joint procurement without necessarily going through joint assessment. Do we have the necessary population data, and are we generating them even after we have joint procurement? The collaboration we saw over COVID was project-based for real-world data collection or for real-world evidence generation. We do have the extended mandate for CDC and critically from the EMA too. And we do have some organizational structures, but they not necessarily facilitate HTA regulations. So there is some further elaboration needed, for example, on how for interventions of public health relevance, critical, they all are important for quality of care, but some more than most, how we can see that structured in the next few years to the implementation phase of 2025. So going forward for cooperation very quickly, also to say that there's been a very interesting message in the last report for public procurement from the XPH. And there it's discussing what more could one hope for in terms of cooperation and coordination, and the need, of course, to link the EU joint procurement, or at least to institutionalize it in terms of how we go across countries and allow countries to navigate it on a voluntary basis. There is also the link, and I think the observatory has been active in that too, in terms of fair pricing and what constitutes fair pricing across countries, and also the variability of population. Last but not least, to say that it's very difficult to capture all these topics. These are the channels in which we exchange different things, different kind of information. I mean, for the European public health, we monitor the regulation and public health interventions. For HCI, we're looking more at new technologies and the RWE and AI space. And there's also an effort to increase capacity because whether we like it or not, the fact is, I think Matthias mentioned that there are 4 countries with over 100 people, but there are many countries with 2, 3, or 4 people in a rudimentary form of HTA. And we are risking lagging behind. We had United 21 coming forward as a continuation of the end of the joint action, but we see more or less half of Europe there, although efforts are being made to have stakeholders. Some effort needs to be done on capacity building. I think this is critical, and also some better understanding. And that's why I said it was well conceived, because HTA can produce clinical guidance, can harmonize that, and can contribute towards how we have more harmonized care delivery with respect to local preferences and needs. So thanks, sorry for going very fast, but despite losing 2 speakers, we were already critical for time. So thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And I'm just going to say that the webinar is recorded. It will be on YouTube. So if it was too fast, you can go back and listen again. I always speak very fast myself. So thank you very much, Elena. Just to point out before we go into
it's a Greek phenomenon, isn't it?
It is. It is. It is. You are absolutely right.
Let me just say that we're doing our best, Reinhard. It's not us, it's our nature. So.
Well, let me point out one thing before we go to the audience participation in the chat box. We had 2 more colleagues on board, 2 great colleagues on board, Rabia Kakveshi from Safe, Affordable and Effective Medicines for Ukrainians, and Rachel Kalf from University of Utrecht, who produced a paper very recently exactly on the link between HTA and quality improvement. Both of them cannot be here with us today due to the current circumstances, but we hope that we will get them in the future, and we will paste the link to Rachel's paper in the chat for those of you who are interested. Erica, I come back to you to give us just a summary, or let's say the bird's eye view of the chat box, because there's been quite an active exchange there, also with some of our speakers participating.
Yes, I mean, it's been a very active chat box, so thank you very much for that. And Reinhard has already sort of jumped in and answered some of the questions. But just to keep it broad, and so, you know, because obviously Matthias and Jelena also have interesting perspectives. A couple of things. One of them is about how we incorporate the patient experience. So, and how can we make this a robust or meaningful thing when the patient experience of quality is so subjective. So that would be one thing that that might be interesting to talk about. Another one is, how can we factor in personalised medicine when you're dealing with very small numbers? How can HTA deal with personalised medicine and quality of care? So thank you very much. Just start with those.
I think we will have to finish with those as well, probably because we only have 7 minutes left. So let me just bring us back. We started off with saying quality of care, effective, safe, patient-centered. So the first round of questions, I would say, is on this patient-centeredness issue of including the patient perspective, and then also the new challenges coming with new technologies. Elena brought that up, I think, already a little bit.
Maybe very briefly flag something. It's also a matter of mandate per agency. For example, and Matthias, please correct me if I'm wrong, the focus in Germany is safety and effectiveness. NICE had added the patient experience into its mandate and so on, and that is reflected in governance, in panels and so on. So it also varies. It's, you know, Europe is very, very, very heterogeneous. So.
I think one point of information here for our speakers is that we have quite a number of participants who are from contexts that don't have established HTA systems yet, as we saw in the poll. So this more general consideration of how we include the patient perspective, there was quite a bit already in the chat, but perhaps we come to you for short statements. Reinhard, I will start with you, if that's okay with you, then go to Matthias and then to Elena.
Lots of questions. I mean, clearly we have a conflict between this. I mean, I wouldn't call it personalized, is always difficult, because I mean, clearly then in the end, we have to leave the idea that we base decisions on evidence coming from previous experience. If we say every person is totally different. So I think we need to realize this, and I think sometimes we have the danger that people who promote the personalized medicine idea too much, that they want to destroy the idea of evidence-based medicine, coming back basically to where an individual health professional together with the individual patient can do whatever they want. And so we have to say, okay, we, on the other hand, that many of our earlier trials were based on too big averages. We couldn't say anything about subgroups. And so clearly we have to become more clever in forming subgroups, which allows us to take more patient characteristics into account when we make decisions. And we know, and Matthias maybe wants to say more, we look at subgroups when we look at the pharmaceutical decision making in Germany. We are inconsequent in not then saying if it is only better for one subgroup that the other subgroups shouldn't get it. So other countries are more stringent there and say, okay, if we see one subgroup, which in the UK they call it optimized for one, or the use is optimized, then we only use it for this one subgroup. I think this is one of the important considerations. And my personal hope is that with that we not only have the joint clinical assessment on the European level, but that with the early dialogue between the producers and the HTA agencies, the countries, that trials will be designed differently, so that within bigger trials, we first of all have real life comparators, and secondly, that we have subgroups which we can analyze separately and have a better evidence base. And maybe just one last sentence, there was also this discussion on the patient reported outcomes and so on. Clearly this is part of it. I mean, that we not only have subgroups on our typical clinical measures, but that we expand our methodology to patient-reported outcomes. We are further already, especially with this ICHOM initiative, that we get new measures which include the patient perspective.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. I think very clear. Going to Matthias for your input on this.
Well, I think in Germany, one can say that most of oncology drugs are already somehow personalized, because we have so many drugs which require certain genetic testing, where the drugs only work in some constellations, that if you break this down in practice, you already have personalized medicine. Personalized should not be mistaken by only fitting to one person, but to, of course, smaller groups of persons. Otherwise, it's not possible to reflect this in clinical trials.
Thank you, Matthias. I think also from the chat and from how much we could discuss this, it might be a good idea for us to have a webinar on personalized medicine. We did have one on genomics, I think, a while ago, but it might be a good point to bring the two together, HTA and personalized medicine, for a revisiting of HTA soon, and then we can discuss this more in depth. Perhaps, maybe very briefly, Matthias, on patient involvement in the GBA HTA activity?
Yes, patient involvement has been established since 2004 in Germany. We have patients in every working group and in every decision-making body within the GBA, and they have their say, and they also contribute a lot in terms of bringing attention to new technologies, file applications, bringing in patients who suffer from diseases and provide their perspective and contribute a lot to the discussions. Patients are not yet taking a part of the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. They can vote, but they cannot participate in the decision. We do not know whether this will change in the future or not.
Okay. Thank you. And I think final points from Elena. Briefly, I think we're already at the end of the hour, and I see also our participants go back to work. have started going back to work.
Briefly, because I'm going to pass now. So
yes. All right.
All the points were touched upon. First of all, because I teach EBM, I mean, the main anchor point of EBM is that it is personalized in the sense of you have to take into consideration how you have the maximum benefit and how you eliminate risk. So many people find, public health and individual health at the antipodes of approaches. And similar to what Reinhard said, some people think it's conflicting. I don't think so, but you need high quality data to be able to have this information. You need transparent governance structures. Also, I come from oncology also, but so what Matthias mentioned echoes. But because of where we're going with PGX, where we're going with pharmacogenomics, and where we're going with all sorts of new technologies in biomedicine and diagnostic techniques and panels and so on, pretty much every type of intervention will be personalized, or will be, if you like, a rare disease in years to come. So Universal Act to safeguard universal access. Universal access does not mean access to the same for everyone. It means access to quality care, to the best possible solution for everyone in the system. And perhaps raising some awareness on that would be good. Also, I think we discuss patients a lot, and this is very important, but at some point for HTA, particularly for public health interventions, and also because HTA can be used to assess different things, we need to involve also carers and more practitioners, but also citizens, just everyone. It's very important, it's very neglected. We have the tools to have preference elicitation to involve larger groups of people. It's important to give it a go. And also to make an effort, I think, at EU-wide level, to have countries which do not have the ability or the capacity to produce high quality data, to see how we can bring them on board. Otherwise, you compromise EU-wide safety and investment and so on. Thank you, and apologies, I have to step out, but thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Elena. We will all step out. I think I'm not going to do a big summary of what we've been talking about. I think it's very clear there is a very specific role for HTA for quality of care. There are a lot of links to other strategies. There are a lot of fundamental pillars of HTA that link well, but it also, as everything else, has to evolve, perhaps regarding the way, the methods, the outcomes, and we could discuss this for quite a while still, and we probably will have to discuss this in more webinars in the future. I think for our participants from outside the EU context, perhaps the EU joint efforts are interesting for the future. I think we also from the EU side need to reflect on how our joint efforts might be useful or not, also for countries outside the joint framework. So I think with this in mind, we've discussed the link of HTA to quality today. We come back to the issue of quality next week with clinical guidelines, and you saw in the presentations, you heard in the spotlights what the link between HTA and clinical guidelines could be, and all of that, of course, linked to quality of care. So join us again next Tuesday for the next round of discussions. Thank you very much to our speakers and to our participants. The webinar will be on the Observatory YouTube channel for everyone to revisit sometime, I think, next week. Thank you all. Have a very nice afternoon and see you soon.